Yeah, indication from Chris.
Uh, you're both right. There's a huge amount of information there to try and digest. But it seems to me that the question that's playing on my mind and probably on everybody's is, how do we set about resisting this global takeover of housing? And although the issue is largely, but not completely, confined to Dublin here, it's an issue that affects cities around the globe. It's a story that you keep hearing repeatedly. And in that sense, the housing issue is being internationalized. Another aspect is that I listened to Conor's podcast, and it dealt with the issue of affordability, and that affordability of housing should be based on income. Now, it seems to me that this is very much a class issue, and it's an issue that should be emanating from the organised working class. You know, the demand should be there, that workers should have a place available to live in. And I do realise that the call for public housing's out there. But my question generally is to anybody really is, how can we mobilise on this so that we can have an impact? Thanks.
Ryan, do you want to come back directly on that, or?
Sorry, I'll come off mute. Yeah, no problem at all. Just one of the things, just on a comment there, Chris, and I'm sure Conor agrees with me on this. In saying it's a Dublin problem or primarily a Dublin issue, that would sort of suggest that somehow there's like the Dublin or Greater Dublin construction industry, and then there's the outside the Greater Dublin construction industry, right? Or there's a within the Greater Dublin property market and an outside of the Greater Dublin property market. There isn't, right? It is a connected ecosystem. And as house prices and rents escalate in Dublin, it radiates out from Dublin. Like, there is only a limited amount of construction capacity in the country. Like, there's only a limited amount of skilled builders, a limited amount of plant machinery, limited to the quarries and so on. And a lot of these things are not easily they're not easily sort of ratcheted up. Like, if you want additional electricians or you want additional carpenters, it takes time to train them up, or maybe to get them to come back from returning immigrants or non-Irish people to come to Ireland with those skills. It takes time. And the issue is, while it's in Dublin, where it's been driven in Dublin, the impact is radiating out across the entire, not just the state, across the entire country. So the sort of spike that we're seeing in rents, which is the Vulture landlords have really aggressive rental strategies. In areas like my own, they're now approaching a cartel in terms of control of the rental sector. So, when you look at new ceilings get set in a given area in the rental market, it tends to be the Vulture landlords set that ceiling, and then all the mom and pop landlords, all the people who had, the accidental landlords, all jump in and go, well, that's the market price, and they too increase their rent. So there's definitely while these developments are primarily in Dublin, the impact is radiating out across the country in terms of rent price, and they're sucking in and control. Like, all of the big developers, you go drive around Dublin, look at all the big development, all the sites that the Vulture landlords have their hands on, all of the sort of construction capacity within the state is being sucked in by these guys. So there isn't enough construction capacity left to build other, for example, housing estates, because they're building apartments for these guys, and these guys are paying top dollar. So, if you're let's say Durkin Construction, Park Development, Jerry Gannon, any of these huge construction companies, instead of building a housing estate on the, where you might build 200 houses and then have to find 200 individual purchasers, and each of them has to get their loan approval, and you have to negotiate 200 different deals. You go to one of these big, you go to DWS or you go to Real IS, and they provide the finance up front. And they guarantee they're going to buy all 1,000 apartments. So you go ahead, you build 1,000 apartments. So essentially, these Irish companies, and they're building relationships with these, you're seeing certain, like Park Development, for example, now I think are selling their third development to Irish Life. Certainly their second. They're also on a one development up in Ballyogan. There, one end they're selling apartment blocks to Urbio, and at the other end they're selling apartment blocks to Irish Life. And that sort of there's an interest and there's a study to be done in it, this relationship that's developing where certain established Irish construction companies that Conor's talked about, and these aren't small now, these would be significant medium to large size players. They're essentially being funded through forward purchasing. They've guaranteed buyers in these companies. And of course, the state is taking 20% of the via the Part 5, so they're guaranteed selling that section, and then they're selling the rest of them to the private landlords, some whom then rent them back to the state via HAP, right? So the state's paying every which way here. The question, the main thing you were saying about the fighting back, look, I think the first thing on this, Chris, is that specifically we're talking about loads of aspects of housing, but tonight we're talking about the kind of institutional landlord, vulture landlord issue. The issue kind of had to boil to a certain point. Like up until 4 years ago, 5 years ago, it was arguably niche. It was arguable this isn't having a huge impact. They're only, they served a useful purpose in buying some stuff, some properties off NAM that nobody else could buy. And it's really in the last, I would say, 36 months that the scale of this has really escalated in that they're purchasing billions of euros worth of housing each year. So in a way, it kind of had to hit a critical mass. So of course, in 2013 and 2015 and 17, people like Conor and others were highlighting that legislation was being passed and that there might be a certain possible outcome from that. But until people could see it happening, and again, that's part of the reason why we did the interactive map, until people can go online and go, oh my Jesus, all these estates that I'm familiar with, all these apartment blocks and complexes in my area, the apartment block I pass on my way to work, the apartment block I pass on my way to college, the building site at the bottom of my mother's road, the empty bit of ground adjacent to my job, these are all have been bought by or are now controlled by vulture landlords. So it kind of had to reach, I think it had to reach kind of a critical mass of impact before people would be shocked enough to waken up. I think we're at that point, by the way. I think the awareness raising, like any campaign, awareness raising is a big part of it. We're all well aware of this. A lot of people, I would say, Mullen Park, was that the one in Maynooth? I think it was that probably woke a lot of people up. Primetime did a show on it that was quite interesting. But like, I think for us in political circles and in housing activist circles, kind of going, we're very aware of this and we're aware of it for a number of years. But there's a lot of people out there, I think it's really much more like the last 12, 18, 24 months that they're even starting to waken up to this. So there's an awareness raising phase in it. There's putting forward alternatives and putting forward credible alternatives to people. That's a really critical element to this. We would argue, obviously, it's around universal public housing, and the building of a grassroots campaign, multi-organisation campaign, but it's against it. But one of the issues has been is actually finding ground that everyone will come on to and stay on. Like at the moment, if you look at, like, say, for example, just vis-a-vis the vulture stuff, I mean, the position of Sinn Féin, who are most likely the next government, or part of the next government in this stage, the like of Social Democrats, Labour, all the larger Social Democrat left-leaning parties in Leinster House, none of them have a position that they want these guys to not be part of the story. They all, at some level, see a place for the institutional landlord. I mean, I've heard housing activists, housing academics 2 or 3 years ago in private conversations talking about how they thought there was a place for these professional landlords, and they were bringing a degree of professionalism to a sector that needed professionalism and regulation and all that sort of stuff. So I don't think the battle is even won within left circles about whether or not these sort of landlords have a place to play in the housing story. So like from our perspective, what we're trying to do is raise awareness to highlight the fact that people, like, this isn't some niche thing that's only affecting high-end apartment blocks in Dublin. This is one element of the problem within the overall housing sector, and one reason why rents are so high, and one significant reason why house prices have gone so high. And we would be arguing that there is no place for the institutional landlords, that we need a model of housing that's, and in essence, I mean, the way, I mean, obviously the Berliners have gone down, you know, it's a very interesting vote, and it was, I think it was very symbolic and important in that regard. But the real way to deal with these sort of ones is for the state to provide universal public housing. And therefore, there's no reason for these guys to exist. You know, there's no reason for private landlords. I mean, the only reason people go into private rental is because, well, 90% of people in private rental go into private rental because they can't access social housing and they can't afford to buy in the private market. If people had a third option, which was secure, affordable rent linked to their income within the public sector, there would be no place for these vultures. The private rental market would essentially collapse. And then the state would be in the lucky position of going to these vulture landlords and saying, well, look, we'll take them off your hands, but we'll take these properties off your hands, but we'll be getting them at a good price. But it's about providing the alternative, I think, rather than thinking that we can kind of regulate or control or, you know, expropriate or whatever in isolation from taking the big leap, the big step, which is to go for universal public housing. But that therefore, I think the issues are related. I think any campaigning on anti-vulture landlords, anti-institutional landlords has to be linked to the call for universal public housing.
Right, thanks. Had an indication from John. You need to unmute.
I'm not taking the blame for that. This is a fascinating meeting. And, you know, as people speak, you see just the layers and layers within it. But it's a very small meeting. So, and it's not that we're just, you know, we're a small group edging in and there's lots bigger meetings happening somewhere else. There's not. So, you know, one of the first things I've got to do is say what we say in order. So last week I read an article by Barry Desmond, one of the richest people in Ireland, and he had private meetings with the government. And what he said is the latest housing plan, which has a budget of 3.5 million, is a criminal act by the government. This is a criminal act by a government because most of this money will flow to attracting transnational capital and getting private capital to build the houses. And they're doing this, they're going to pay these people 5% on capital at a time when they can borrow directly at about 0.02% of capital. So this is a sort of, that should be making more news. You know, one of the top businessmen in the country is condemning the government and accusing them of criminal behavior. But rather than not making a wave, there's silence. And one of the reasons there's silence is that the government announced this program and it was supposed to be followed fairly quickly by a mass demonstration led by the Congress of Trade Unions. It was cancelled on very flimsy grounds. And there's been almost nothing, you know, I mean, people like Sinn Féin criticised the thing, but basically their criticisms were sort of campaign promises. If we get in, we'll build twice as much house, it's far cheaper, and we'll use more public sector stuff, or it'll be more affordable, or just essentially gobbledygook, especially when you know what Sinn Féin's doing in the north. So I think that's the issue. There's two issues there, I think. One is, how do we do more of this? Is there any way we can? I'm not sure I'm totally agree with what Conor says. It sounded like it was, you know, a choice by Irish capital. I'm not 100% sure that it is. You know, it's sort of, you know, you've got a country where the transnational sector is bigger than the native sector, and where the government sees its role to act as agents for these people and not for not for any, not for any sizable sector of the Irish population. So, how you would break out of that with the current class structure is hard to see. But I'm going to boil it down to how the hell do we get a broader discussion?
Yeah, Connor.
Yeah, just to kind of come back on just like just what kind of just what kind of John said there. It's not a choice by kind of Irish kind of capital. I mean, it is true that in industry, transnational capital has a higher footprint than indigenous. That wasn't the case in construction. It had zero footprint until 2009. And the reason being is that Anglo-Irish Bank fucking blew up. I mean, 62 billion. Ireland had to be, the South had to be brought into an IMF kind of bailout. There was a decade of kind of austerity. And now transnational capital with its kind of middlemen backers in finance and housing, like in the state and through NAMA, have just moved in. So they've taken advantage of that vacuum that is there, and they've bought up Irish indigenous capital's assets for the song. Like, I mean, this is almost like, the kind of post kind of Cromwellian kind of clearances where they just a land grabbing that was going on. Like, they've moved in here and they have literally just taken all these assets off kind of Irish kind of capital and have just made them their own. There's a huge clash that is going on in like Irish kind of capitalism at the moment, which from a kind of distance is kind of fascinating. But I mean, that's the story that is going on here. They had no footprint, none whatsoever, until Anglo-Irish Bank went broke. Because what's happened now is that Irish banks are on an investment strike. They're on a investment strike. They are not investing in the type of construction that is needed, and it's obvious that there's a need for it. Now, I still have to do kind of more research into just why they're doing that kind of investment strike, but that's what they're doing. So, like, it's not a choice by them. And like Dermot Desmond's column is a great kind of example of that. He was never one of those kind of compradors, even though he was involved in the IFSC, he got out of that in the mid 1990s. Like Tony O'Reilly, there's your comprador, Irish kind of comprador middleman. You know what I mean? Like, he was a manager for Heinz. That's your comprador there. Dermot Desmond, he's different, So he can see all of this. He doesn't care about, he's actually saying, why are these guys making billions out of us? But he has no standing. Yeah, he can pick up the phone, but no one listens to him. Policy hasn't changed kind of one bit. So the land grab, just pardon the kind of crude analogy, that has gone on since kind of 2009. That's what's kind of playing out now. In terms of where we go from here, I think what's happened in the South is that I would say that it's not hyperbole to say that the only reason why Sinn Féin is on 30% is because of its housing policy. It's because of Owen O'Brien, and he's seen as being kind of credible. Because Sinn Féin were on 6% in the local elections 18 months prior to the general kind of election. They got 10% in the locals, and they got 6% in the presidential election. 6%, they lost half of their councillors in 2019. 2018, and now they're the largest party by far, like in the southern state. Like, so I think that a lot of where that protest has gone into what is an ill-judged kind of fate in kind of Sinn Féin to kind of solve this. And there's not a hair's breadth there between the kind of policy of Sinn Féin, Soc Dems, and Labour, as Brian kind of pointed out. It's the very same one. And what's so frustrating about that policy is that, as Brian said, they've completely taken on board the right wing's view of what constitutes social housing and what constitutes kind of social rents, which is that they're linked to kind of market price for some, which is mad. You know, like, it's crazy how you have to point out that affordability should be linked to income. Like, why is that even an argument? That's just bloody common sense. Like, but the definition of affordable rent by the state, and one that the three main kind of centrist kind of left parties have kind of signed up to, is that it is 15% below kind of market rates. And the reason being that is that it's all about ensuring that the institutional investors get that 3.6% like return on their investment here. They're getting 2% in like Berlin. Like, they are creaming it here in terms of it. A 3.6% kind of return is almost double just what they're getting like Berlin or in Amsterdam, you know? So they're absolutely laughing. And the most frustrating thing about the social housing kind of policy of the three main kind of left kind of parties or kind of centrist parties is that there are no EU rules against social housing. It's got nothing to do with kind of state aid rules. You can actually, a state can build and sell social housing at below kind of market price, and there's nothing that the EU will like say about it. Absolutely nothing. So there's absolutely no need, legally even, for Sinn Féin and Labour and the Soc Dems to sign up to a Fine Gael kind of definition of what is kind of social housing. None whatsoever. There's absolutely no rules against below cost social housing for sale as part of a universal kind of thing, or for rent either. Like, rents in the south should start at around 160 euros a month and should average around 400 euros a month. Same for kind of mortgage and repayments. If you want a socially stable housing system, the definition of affordable rents that even Sinn Féin can put forward starts at 800 euros a month. So I think that if there's any kind of hope kind of going forward, it's on the streets, because like, I think that people are going to have. I do think that people have put their fate in, not even in Sinn Féin, but in kind of Eoin O'Brien to kind of sort this out, and that's not going to happen because, and that's got nothing against kind of Eoin, it's to do with the policies. You can see that you cannot charge people 1,000 euros for social housing and expect things to work out well. Not when the average wage, like in the south, is, well, the median wage, it's around 26,000 euros a month or a year. That's the structural problem that any kind of government is kind of is like facing. But there's absolutely nothing stopping them building 70, 80,000 houses over a 10-year, over a 5-10-year period. There's nothing stopping them now for starting the whole apprenticeship kind of scheme by actually paying apprenticeships a full kind of living wage as part of that skills gap. There's a policy which should be kind of announced now, but it's not. So I think that, like, and it's not just because Brian is here. I have said this kind of otherwise. I think what kind of Eirigi are doing is what should be, is actually where the game is. It is in kind of providing those tools for when that head of steam kind of builds up. I mean, that kind of website, I mean, I've used it, countless people have. That's the type of stuff that for kind of small groups, just like ourselves, or kind of individual researchers, I think that's a really good use of skills, because that's going to kick off. I don't think we can change that kind of, there's a head of steam now behind Sinn Féin going to sort out housing. And there's a head of steam there, and it's not kind of falling off. So until they get into government with the Soc Dems and with Labour, and you can see that this isn't changing anything. I think, unfortunately, until that happens, we're not going to see kind of much movement like in the South. I do think people have put their faith in Lagona Brian as the solution for this. And until that's proven to be wrong, I don't see kind of much movement. You know, they're happening, they're in it. So it is about kind of preparing for that, for the street kind of campaigns. That's my only thing, is like, even if Sinn Féin was the most kind of left-wing kind of government, you would still need a strong kind of street campaign anyway, because like politicians, fuck them, you know. You know, it doesn't matter who they are. Like, the most radical you'll ever be as a politician is the day before you go into government. After that, the clock is ticking. It's just to be watered down. They're like watered down. So it's always about the streets. Sorry, that was a big rant there.
All right, Brian, you wanted to get back in?
I think we'd be getting used to microphones and mutes, wouldn't you? Yeah, no, just Conor's made, just some of the points Conor's made there. I think the theoretical discussion about housing and the practical discussion about how do you build a mass movement, or why don't we see a mass movement, like, they're completely related. And I think, again, part of the reason we aren't seeing the sort of major move on the streets, which we should be seeing at this stage, is because the theoretical elements of it are still, like, the forces that people are looking to lead the housing movement, Sinn Féin, the trade union movement, are essentially not putting forward. One, they're not trying to mobilize people, but also their proposed solutions are so close in from a theoretical basis and a policy basis to what's existing. There's no real scope there. I mean, like, to build mass movement, like, for example, like, broadly talking, the tenure we have at the moment is owner-occupier, and again, I'm talking for the state here, owner-occupiers in around the 70% mark, private rental is in around 20%, the public housing and approved housing bodies is about 10%, roughly. So it's a 70-20-10 mix. They're now going to introduce cost rental, which is a bizarre thing to do, where you're linking rental income to the cost of construction in a state where it has always been impossible to control construction costs, rather than linking it to income, which again is the only measure of affordability, is linking it to the income of the tenant. Why would you link the rent that they're paying to the cost of construction where they're living, right? It makes no sense. But Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Sinn Féin, the Soc Dems and Labour have all signed up to cost rental as part of the solution, right? So you're now going to have two-tier social housing. You're going to have people living, think about this, you're going to have people living on a street or in a block of apartments where some tenants who are social housing tenants, their rent will be calculated on their income. And the people living next door in an identical apartment or house are going to have their rent calculated on the cost of construction, right? It's insane. It's madness. And yet that's what all the big parties are signed up. Now, Sinn Féin have now cottoned on a bit late in the day, as are the other parties, that cost rental, because construction costs can't be controlled. If you pure cost rental, the rent would be still in the region of 1,200, 1,400, 1,500 under the current model of how they procure. This has to how they procure construction procurement rules and how profit gets built into for the developer and so on. So Sinn Féin are now calling it affordable cost rental. So it's going to be cost rental that isn't really linked to the cost of construction. It's going to be linked to the cost of construction and the marketplace, and then subsidised by the state. I mean, it's so to bring it back down to, I think they're talking about €900 as an acceptable level. Again, this is about structural change. It's about at a society level, in the way that society's took a decision to introduce primary school level education or introduce secondary level education. It's one of those once in a multi-generation where you take a decision which will take decades to fully implement. You'll have the benefits within a few years, but the full benefits won't be felt for decades. And that's the decision facing our society, is at that level of, do you want to break that structural model and go for a model which might be more like 30 to 40% public housing, 40, 50, 60, 70% private ownership, and essentially have no private rental, bar maybe high-end luxury, right? And that kind of model has huge implications. It has huge implications for private banking sector that is, peddles billions of euros of mortgages every year. It has huge implications for all the people who have second and third homes that they're renting out, which is a couple of 100,000 people in the South. I think it's 200,000 people have at least one rental property. Leo Varadkar's point a couple of weeks ago that one person's rent is somebody else's income, So the structural change at that level, that's what a campaign should be calling for. Real structural change in the housing market to finally give people a third option of secure, affordable, linked to income, high quality public housing, mixed income housing estates, mixed income apartment developments, permanently owned by the state, permanent security tenor, intergenerational tenancies, rent, if you need to drop out of the workforce because you're ill or you want to go back to retrain or you're having kids, your rent is adjusted. If you're in the period of your life where you're bringing decent coin in, your rent goes up a bit. I've done public meetings, dozens, well, certainly a couple of dozen on housing around the country prior to COVID. And time again, I have been stunned by how far people are ahead of the politicians on this one. When we put forward our arguments on universal public housing, and I know you could argue people coming into our meetings maybe are leaning that way anyway, but I mean, we did one meeting here in Dundrum. It was still at the Central Mental Hospital. Might have been 100 odd people at it. Wide mix, middle class, working class, local council estates, local private estates. And everybody got the idea of universal public housing after a 2-minute explanation. And, I remember one little old guy got up, I'd say in his 70s, and he just called it, he just went, listen, this is what we need to do. The council needs to build public houses and we need to rent them at affordable. And that's how you solve this problem. Big round of applause, and that's a meeting, a Green Party meeting I went to here, organised by Catherine Martin, went to the meeting, spoke from the floor. And the same thing, the Green Party supporters, big round of applause. We're talking universal public housing, right? I think people get it. I think the problem is politicians. As people know, I was Sinn Féin national organiser. I was part of that movement for 17 years. I know them all well. And I can guarantee, and it's not about personality, it's about policy. And their policies, in the last election, they went in, Fine Gael were talking about building 10,000 social housing units. Sinn Féin said, we'll build 12,000. So it isn't actually about a radical, what they're doing, and Conor's right about this. All Sinn Féin need to do at this point, and Labour and the Social Democrats are trying the same thing, is position yourself slightly more radical than Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. That way, you have the chance of attracting in Fianna Gael and Fianna Fáil votes and preference votes. You don't scare the horses, right? And simultaneously, you have your own base that you already have in the bag. So in a way, like Eoin Bryn doesn't need to put forward, and Sinn Féin don't need to put forward a super radical housing policy that will take several decades to fully develop and all of the benefits to be seen, right? They don't need to do that. They just need to put forward a housing policy to win in the next election. And the best way to do that, from a very cynical political point of view, is don't scare the horses, right? So even there today, I was reading an article in the Irish Times about REITs and about how all these international funds are studying Sinn Féin policy, and they're kind of worried about what Sinn Féin is going to do. And that's how it'll go. We'll be told the international money markets are going to, there'll be a run on Irish banks. The international money markets will refuse to loan money to the state. All that kind of scare story stuff will be whipped up. And essentially the Shinners, I believe, on my experience involving housing, pretty hands-on now for the last 5 years, having done a significant number of meetings, having talked to any number of people, I think people would be up for public housing. I think if Sinn Féin came out tomorrow and said, you know what, we're going for universal public housing, this is what it's going to look like, I think they'd actually get as much support and more. But they won't do it. One, because they ideologically don't believe in it, and two, because it's riskier than the strategy they're currently doing. And unfortunately, this is coming back to the point that's been asked about how do you build a movement. In my 30 and odd years of political activism, there is a deep embedded culture in this state, which essentially is that if you want change, you wait for the next election. You ambush them at the next election. If you want change, vote for the other crowd. And then when the other crowd get in, vote for the other crowd. And that's deeply embedded in the political culture. So, I mean, it isn't, I don't think there is a quick fix that will put, large numbers of people on the street tomorrow on the issue of housing. I'm not as sure as Conor that has to run through this cycle with Sinn Féin getting into power and then being seen to fail. But certainly when you explain to people, it takes 3 to 4 years to really shift housing around, and the next government could be 3 years away, 3.5 years away. So if this government runs its full term and if Sinn Féin get in and they attempt to change, even moderate change in housing, it's 6 years away before you'd really start to see the impact of that. So when you talk to people in those terms and you say to them, or you can get on the streets today and actually force this government in the next 6 months or a year to adopt or change its housing policy, even if it's only slightly more progressive. I think they're the kind of arguments which you make with people. It's actually taken on this idea, this culture of waiting until the next election to ambush the government. I think you have to, equip people with the political arguments as to why universal public housing is the way to go. As a small organisation, we think the best thing we can do, sort of which Conor's alluded to, is stuff like the Track the Vultures map. It is putting forward arguments around universal public housing and drawing people, preparing people into that space. But certainly, I don't think you're going to see a big housing movement until we resolve those issues. Those groups that are part of the new housing movement, I don't think there's space for people to be in that movement who are saying, well, we want social housing and we want affordable and we want the cost rent and we see a place for the vulture landlords. Like, you actually need to be talking in much more fundamental terms about, as I say, the kind of shift, the kind of massive policy decision that, for example, universal education was. This is about universal housing. It's at that scale, and I don't see that coming if you're in a coalition, if you're in a housing group where half of the organisations really are just want to tweak around the edges, which is unfortunately where the Soc Dems, where Sinn Féin, elements of the trade union movement, although there are some good trade unionists who've been making the right, certainly I've talked to 100% think universal housing, public housing is the way to go. But I think that in terms of building the movement, the ground bases, that's where meetings like this are important. And I know they're small. Like, we all wished there was 1,000 people on this meeting, but there's not. So we have to start from where we are. And I think, good propaganda, well thought out arguments, and preparing the ground and waiting for the conditions, one, for the housing itself to reach crisis, but also for the weakness of the social democrat type parties, for the weakness of their housing policies to be exposed.
All right. So it's just after 8:15. So I'm going to do one more round to see if anyone wants to make a discussion point or to ask a direct question. So is there any indications? Yeah, Pat.
How's it going? Yeah, thanks for organising this meeting. It's very interesting and great input from Conor and Brian there. I was just thinking about the building a movement, and I was thinking, say if there was some crisis come up, say if there was electricity blackouts or something like that, and there's a crisis in government and they collapse and there's say if there's a change in government, like I just think that the housing situation, the housing protest movement will get people that end up putting their faith in Sinn Féin, and it'll go to like I just think that Sinn Féin could absorb all the energy of a housing movement, and people could just go, okay, give them a chance, they get in power and see how they do, and the whole thing, like, the energy will dissipate, So I'm thinking about how do you keep the protest movement intact, and keep it driving forward and pushing Sinn Féin more and more to the left and more to a sensible policy to actually achieve something, Like if this drags on until this government goes on for the next 3 years and lives its full term, and then we build up a housing movement, and then Sinn Féin get a chance in power, like it's how to keep it going, keep it going past just people go, okay, we give them a chance and that they get power, and no, Green, sure, he's a lovely chap, so he's going to look after us and get all the guards and the nurses, the house and all that, It's how do you keep it going and drive this argument of, like, when we say public houses and public land, we actually mean public house and public land. We don't mean 60% private on that public land. We mean the whole lot, that it's at the end of the day, it's an ideological argument for just to get away from the use of housing as a commodity by private profiteers. And the other thing is about affordability. You know, affordability, it has to be linked to wages, which links to the minimum wage, the living wage, all that sort of stuff. So it can be linked to a campaign, the campaign for an actual living wage. And if employers want the living wage to be dropped down, they're going to have to figure a way of actually reducing the cost of housing to an affordable level. Like, you know, if they told me, okay, you want to be more competitive in the market, like, well, okay, get the housing sorted out. The whole thing can be linked in together, you know. I just think that sort of thing. That's all. That's just what I wanted to say. Anyway.
Orla?
Yeah. I saw this Channel 4 video about Vienna, and they have something like 60% of the population there are actually in social housing. And it's not just that your housing is more secure and everything, but the actual planning is much, much better even than what you would get here, because they're planning things like facilities into these units that they're building. And I do think as well, it'd be kind of quite easy in a way, like if people knew their children, for example, could potentially get on these housing lists, you know, I think there'd be public support there for it. Like if you see things like that, like, and the difference it makes and the impact it has, it just looked amazing, I have to say, looking at it.
Right. So just, is there anyone else, before I bring Conor and Brian back, is there anyone else who wants to ask a question or make a discussion point? John, you've indicated again.
Well, I want to come back at Pat just with what Brian said, which is that there's this absolute conviction that you can vote for the other character and wait for the next election and vote for the other character. But the problem is people weren't always like that, or at least there was a sizable part of the population who weren't always like that. And the problem is we're talking about individual sentences and we're talking about individual words, but there's a whole book behind that. So, for example, throughout the early part of my political life, the word imperialism would have meant something to people. You know, if you said housing has now been driven by imperialist forces intervening in Ireland, everybody know their head and know what you were talking about. Now people think that imperialism is a good thing that has brought the peace process and peace to Ireland, you know, and also gives us money to build houses. You know, it's a tremendous job we take on, but you know, I think there's a really positive attitude from everybody at the meeting to take on that job.
Can I just ask a couple of questions? The first one to Brian. You mentioned that making the argument for public housing, but it seems to me that public housing is a concept that's very rarely mentioned, and it's been replaced by this concept of social housing, which is very vague and has deliberately muddied the waters between what is social housing. Is a housing owned by local authorities? Is local authorities leasing housing off Vulture funds? Is that social housing? You know, so it's, you know, in terms of public housing, sort of public ownership is a sort of the key element to it. And also a question to Conor. So in terms of these inflated property prices, how much are they linked into the Troika program for the recovery of Ireland's financial institutions, improving the sort of the debt ratios on the books of Irish banks? In terms of also more broader terms in terms of capitalism, we've had these sort of acid bubbles again and again and again, but they always end in the same place. That's a collapse, you know. So is this destined for a collapse, or we're going to have a NAMA Mark II at some point? So just before Conor and Brian come back, I'll ask just one more time. Does anyone else want to come in and make a discussion point or ask a question? No.